We're getting some news out of Washington. Our Emily Wilkins live on Capitol Hill with that. Hey, Em.
Hey, Scott. Well, the Trump White House just secured two major wins here with the House of Representatives. Trump vetoed two bills that had gotten very strong bipartisan support, both for infrastructure projects in two parts of the country. But after Trump vetoed them, lawmakers just voted and they failed to override that veto, with a number of Republicans, majority of Republicans, voting now with the president to oppose legislation that they just supported only a little bit ago. It's a sign of strength as far as how much Trump has control over members of Congress and how much Republicans are willing to continue to stand behind the president. Scott?
Just to be clear, you're saying that some of the Republicans who voted for it recently have now voted against it to override the veto.
Yes. Yes, because of Trump's veto, they have decided to change their vote on these issues and support Trump in voting against the legislation that they were previously voted for.
Hey everyone, welcome Adam. Here, so what just happened, guys? Something quiet but consequential just happened in the House. No dramatic speeches, no press conferences, just a deliberate procedural maneuver that most of the press corps barely noticed. The House formally positioned itself to override two presidential vetoes. The chamber Trump spent years treating as a rubber stamp just signaled in the most understated way possible that the coalition he called unbreakable has cracked.
President Trump attends a New Year's Eve party at his Mar-a-Lago estate tonight. The president has spent the past few days meeting with world leaders, but the White House says 2026 will be focused on issues here at home. CBS's Aaron Navarro is at the White House with details.
This year, and I think you're going to see an economic boom. You're going to
White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt is looking forward to the new year, saying President Trump is focused on the domestic agenda in 2026.
The president is just laser focused around the clock, and I've seen this firsthand. It's really remarkable how hard he works to make our country safer and more prosperous, and I think the best is yet to come in 2026.
Let us be absolutely clear about what Donald Trump chose to veto, because the substance of these bills reveals something essential about the nature of this presidency and about why even members of his own party are beginning to calculate that blind loyalty carries costs they can no longer afford.
Today, Republicans in Congress killed a clean drinking water project in Colorado because President Trump told them to. Congress just unanimously approved that project last year. But that was before President Trump promised retribution against Colorado over his false election rigging claims. Republicans largely fell in line today, preserving the president's veto of that water project.
This common sense, bipartisan and bicameral bill passed both House and Senate unanimously.
It was simple, non-controversial, boring even. A bill to extend the repayment period for a federally funded water project.
In the West, water means survival.
But in Congress, political survival for Republicans means obeying President Trump, even when Trump ordered Republicans to abandon the clean drinking water project for Colorado that had passed Congress without opposition.
The first veto-targeted legislation that would have delivered clean drinking water to more than 50,000 residents of Colorado. This was not some controversial policy proposal mired in partisan warfare. This was a bipartisan infrastructure measure sponsored by none other than Boebert, a figure hardly known for crossing the former president. The bill addressed a genuine public health crisis in communities where water sources have become contaminated and dangerous.
A project that Trump himself had funded and celebrated before he began promising retribution against Colorado.
The president has declared war on our state.
Colorado's Democrats and Republicans in the House pleaded with their colleagues to stand up for Congress's role, to stand against obvious political retribution.
How would you feel if a project like this in your district, passing unanimously, fulfilled a decades-long promise and was vetoed anyway? That's what these rural communities are facing. My constituents are watching, and your constituents are watching.
Let me be abundantly clear. It does not matter if your community supported Donald Trump politically. If we don't take this step, trust me, no town is safe. No county is safe. No state is safe from political retaliation by the administration.
Where families face both health risks and financial burdens simply to access something that most Americans take for granted every time they turn a faucet handle. Donald Trump looked at this legislation that every single member of Congress had supported, and he vetoed it. The motivations behind this veto reveal the petty and vindictive calculus that now governs executive decision-making. Lauren Boebert committed the unforgivable sin in Trump's worldview of signing onto a discharge petition designed to force the release of Epstein-related documents. That act of institutional independence, of placing transparency obligations above personal fealty to the president, earned her a presidential veto of legislation that would have directly benefited her own constituents. The people of Colorado are being punished because their representative dared to support a mechanism for revealing what the administration has worked so diligently to conceal. Additionally, Colorado's refusal to release Tina Peters, a convicted felon who was deeply entangled in efforts to subvert the previous election results, has placed the entire state in Trump's crosshairs. The veto represents collective punishment, a president using his constitutional authority not to advance sound policy, but to settle personal scores and enforce political compliance. The second veto is equally revealing and perhaps even more disturbing in its implications. It concerns the Miccosukee tribe, whose ancestral and ceremonial lands lie within the Everglades region. The Trump administration, operating in concert with Florida authorities, disregarded tribal sovereignty and built what has been accurately described as a detention facility on sacred tribal grounds. The Miccosukee tribe pursued legal remedies, filing suit against both the federal government and the state of Florida over this hastily constructed immigrant detention complex erected on land the tribe calls home. In response, Trump vetoed funding for a tribal water project that had secured broad bipartisan backing. The veto message itself is astonishing in its candor about the president's motivations. Trump explicitly cited the tribe's opposition to his immigration policies as justification for denying them clean water infrastructure. This is not governance. This is retaliation dressed in the formal language of a veto message. A sovereign Native American tribe exercised its legal rights to challenge federal action on its ancestral territory, and the president's response was to deny them funding for basic water infrastructure. Speaker Mike Johnson, the man ostensibly leading the House of Representatives, has demonstrated repeatedly that his conception of leadership consists entirely of executing whatever Donald Trump demands. Marjorie Taylor Greene captured this dynamic with brutal precision when she observed that the House lacks a genuine speaker, that Johnson is speaker in name only, a mere conduit for presidential directives rather than an independent constitutional actor exercising the powers of his office. This characterization is not hyperbole. It is an accurate description of how the current House leadership operates. Johnson does not set an agenda based on the institutional interests of the legislative branch or the policy preferences of his conference. He awaits instructions and then implements them. Given this dynamic, how did it come to pass that the House, through a unanimous consent motion executed with minimal public attention, placed consideration of these two veto messages on its calendar for formal action when members returned to session? The answer lies in the rapidly deteriorating political position of Speaker Johnson himself. His grip on the gavel has never been particularly secure, dependent as it is on the sufferance of a fractious conference that includes members who view him with barely concealed contempt. But recent developments have transformed a tenuous speakership into one hanging by a single fraying thread. When Congress reconvenes, it will confront a convergence of crises that even the most skilled legislative tactician would struggle to manage, and Johnson has demonstrated repeatedly that legislative skill is not among his primary assets. The Epstein document cover-up, the administration's systematic violation of transparency obligations regarding materials that multiple federal judges have ordered released, will dominate the political conversation. The gag orders and contempt findings that have accumulated as the administration has fought disclosure with every procedural weapon available have created a factual record that even the most loyal Republican members find increasingly difficult to defend in their districts. Suburban voters who abandoned MAGA candidates in previous cycles are watching closely, and they are drawing conclusions that terrify Republican strategists. Simultaneously, the government is hurtling toward yet another shutdown deadline. The previous funding crisis was resolved through a temporary extension that merely kicked the confrontation down the road. That road now ends in a matter of weeks, and Congress has scheduled a mere 12 legislative days to address the situation. Let those numbers sink in. 12 days. 9 of the 12 annual appropriations bills remain unfinished. The basic machinery of funding the federal government, the most fundamental responsibility Congress possesses, has been neglected to a degree that would constitute gross incompetence in any other organizational context. But within the current House majority, incompetence has been elevated to an operating principle. The combination of these pressures has created conditions where even a speaker utterly subservient to the president must occasionally allow the legislative process to function, if only to relieve pressure that would otherwise explode in more damaging ways. Johnson understands that his speakership cannot survive both a government shutdown and a full conference revolt over the veto overrides and the mounting evidence of obstruction regarding Epstein materials. Something had to give. And so, with deliberate quietness, the House agreed by unanimous consent to place the veto messages on its calendar for consideration. The procedural posture is now established. When the House returns, it will consider whether to override Donald Trump's vetoes of the Colorado Clean Water legislation and the Miccosukee Tribal Water Project. The constitutional requirement is unambiguous. A two-thirds vote in both the House and the Senate is necessary to override a presidential veto and enact legislation over the executive's objection. Here is where the political dynamics become genuinely fascinating. Both of these bills, the Colorado Water Measure and the Miccosukee Tribal legislation, passed with unanimous support when originally considered. Every single member of the House, Republican and Democrat alike, voted to advance these measures. Donald Trump, acting alone and for reasons having nothing to do with the merits of the legislation, chose to block them. The override votes will force every Republican member to make a choice that carries immediate and visible political consequences. Do they vote to override the veto, thereby supporting clean water for Colorado families and for a Native American tribe, but simultaneously defying Donald Trump in the most public way possible? Or do they vote to sustain the veto, thereby demonstrating that their loyalty to Trump outweighs any commitment to their own prior legislative positions, any concern for the constituents who would benefit from these projects, and any pretense of institutional independence from executive control? The mathematics of the situation are revealing. These bills passed unanimously. To sustain Trump's veto, dozens of Republican members will have to switch their positions, voting against legislation they previously supported. That switch will require explanation to constituents who will be told, by Democratic opponents and by independent media, that their representative chose loyalty to Trump over clean water for American communities. In competitive districts, in suburban areas where voters have already demonstrated willingness to abandon candidates perceived as Trump puppets, that explanation will be extraordinarily difficult to deliver convincingly. The Miccosukee veto override carries additional dimensions of political toxicity. Voting to sustain a veto that explicitly punishes a Native American tribe for exercising its legal rights to challenge federal action on its ancestral lands is not a position that lends itself to elegant defense. The veto message itself, which candidly acknowledges that the denial of water infrastructure funding is retaliation for the tribe's opposition to immigration policies, will be read aloud in campaign advertisements. It will be quoted in editorials. It will be cited by tribal governments across the country who will draw conclusions about which party respects tribal sovereignty and which party views tribes as obstacles to be punished. The Senate presents a different but related set of calculations. Even if the House musters the two-thirds majority required for override, which would require significant Republican defections, the Senate must also act. Senate Republicans have demonstrated somewhat greater willingness to assert institutional prerogatives than their House counterparts. The War Powers Resolution vote, though falling short, showed that a meaningful faction of Senate Republicans is prepared to break with Trump on constitutional questions. The tariff votes demonstrated that economic interests can, in certain circumstances, override partisan loyalty. The question now is whether clean water for Colorado and for the Miccosukee tribe presents a similar calculus. The broader context within which these override votes will occur amplifies their significance. The Epstein discharge petition succeeded in forcing document release over administration obstruction because enough Republicans concluded that the political cost of continued cover-up exceeded the political cost of defying Trump. That same dynamic now applies to the veto overrides. The Affordable Care Act subsidy extension, advanced through similar discharge petition mechanisms, will also reach the floor and force Republicans to take positions on healthcare access that will feature prominently in upcoming campaigns. The convergence of these separate but related confrontations creates an environment where individual Republican members must repeatedly choose between Trump's preferences and their own political survival. The government funding deadline adds urgency to all of these calculations. A shutdown would be catastrophic for Republican electoral prospects. The historical record is unambiguous on this point. When government funding lapses and federal services are disrupted, voters consistently blame the party perceived as controlling the relevant institutions. Republicans control the House. Republicans control the White House. A shutdown would be their shutdown, their responsibility, their political liability. Johnson understands this, which is why he is desperately seeking off-ramps from confrontation, even as Trump demands maximalist positions that make confrontation inevitable. The scheduled legislative days are insufficient to address the accumulated business even under optimal conditions, and conditions are far from optimal. The appropriations process, which should have been completed months ago, remains mired in disputes that reflect fundamental disagreements about the size and scope of federal spending. These disagreements cannot be resolved through the normal order because the normal order has been systematically dismantled. The House operates not through regular committee processes and floor deliberation, but through emergency extensions and last-minute deals that merely postpone rather than resolve underlying conflicts. The showerhead legislation that Johnson has prioritized, an amendment to the Energy Policy and Conservation Act, revising definitions related to bathroom fixtures, captures the essential dysfunction of the current House majority. While clean water projects go unfunded, while government shutdown looms, while constitutional confrontations over war powers and judicial independence multiply, the Speaker's legislative agenda features showerhead definitions. This is not a caricature. This is the actual legislative output of a Congress that has abandoned any pretense of addressing the genuine challenges confronting the nation. The discharge petition mechanism that forced action on Epstein documents and Affordable Care Act subsidies represents perhaps the most significant institutional development of this congressional session. Discharge petitions were historically rare and almost never successful precisely because they require members to publicly break with their party leadership. The fact that multiple discharge petitions have succeeded, that Republican members have signed on to efforts that Speaker Johnson opposed, signals a fundamental erosion of leadership control over the conference. Members who were once willing to subordinate their individual political judgment to collective party strategy are increasingly concluding that collective party strategy offers them nothing but electoral peril. The veto override votes will provide the next test of this dynamic. If Republicans who previously supported the Colorado and Miccosukee water projects now vote to sustain Trump's veto, they will be demonstrating that leadership control, or more accurately Trump's control exercised through Johnson, remains sufficient to compel members to vote against their own prior positions and their own constituents' interests. If significant numbers of Republicans vote to override, they will be demonstrating that the bonds of loyalty have weakened to the point where members are willing to defy Trump publicly on matters where the policy merits and constituent interests clearly favor defiance. The Colorado clean water situation illustrates the human stakes that abstract legislative maneuvering often obscures. More than 50,000 Americans in Colorado communities lack reliable access to clean drinking water. The environmental conditions in certain regions of the state produce water sources contaminated with naturally occurring toxins at levels that pose genuine health risks. The legislation Trump vetoed would have funded infrastructure to address this public health crisis, delivering clean water to families who currently face both health hazards and financial burdens associated with obtaining safe drinking water. This is not a policy abstraction. This is about whether children in rural Colorado will have water they can safely drink from their kitchen taps. Trump vetoed this legislation because Lauren Boebert signed a discharge petition regarding Epstein documents, and because Colorado has not released Tina Peters, a convicted felon. The connection between these grievances and clean water for Colorado families is non-existent. The veto serves no legitimate policy purpose. It advances no coherent governing philosophy. It exists solely as an instrument of personal retaliation, a demonstration that the powers of the presidency can and will be wielded to punish those who fail to demonstrate sufficient personal loyalty. The Miccosukee situation is, if anything, more egregious. A sovereign Native American tribe whose ancestral connection to the Everglades predates the existence of the United States government exercised its legal rights to challenge federal construction on its ceremonial lands. This is precisely how the system is supposed to function. A party aggrieved by government action seeks redress through established legal processes. The proper response from the executive branch would be to defend its actions in court, to negotiate with the tribe, or to modify its plans to accommodate tribal concerns. The actual response was to veto funding for a water project that would serve the tribe's basic infrastructure needs, explicitly citing the tribe's opposition to immigration policies as justification. This is the behavior of a ruler who views all institutional actors, tribes, states, members of Congress, judges, as either instruments to be used or obstacles to be punished. There is no space in this worldview for legitimate disagreement, for good faith opposition, for the exercise of independent judgment that happens to reach conclusions different from the president's. Every contrary action is either betrayal or insubordination, and both categories warrant retribution. The House revolt, quiet as it was in its initial procedural manifestation, represents something genuinely significant. It demonstrates that the unified Republican front Trump has maintained through a combination of personal dominance and political intimidation is developing cracks that cannot be easily sealed. Members who signed discharge petitions have already demonstrated willingness to break ranks on matters of sufficient importance. Members who voted for the underlying water legislation now face a choice that will reveal whether their prior votes reflected genuine policy commitments or mere performative gestures that could be abandoned the moment Trump demanded abandonment. The coming weeks will determine whether this quiet revolt becomes a visible rupture. The Affordable Care Act subsidy extension vote will provide an initial measure of the conference's willingness to defy Trump on health care policy. The veto override votes will provide a more direct measure, forcing members to choose between sustaining Trump's petty retribution or delivering clean water to American communities. The government funding negotiations will determine whether the conference can perform even the most basic functions of governance without descending into chaos. Johnson's speakership may not survive this convergence of pressures. If he cannot deliver government funding without a shutdown, if he cannot manage the veto override votes in a way that satisfies his conference, if the Epstein document revelations continue to dominate political discourse, the already fragile coalition that keeps him in the speaker's chair may simply collapse. The members who view him with contempt, and their numbers are not insignificant, may conclude that the costs of maintaining him as speaker exceed whatever benefits his continued service provides. The Senate's role in all of this remains uncertain. Senate Republicans have shown somewhat greater institutional independence than their House counterparts, but the dynamics are different. Senators serve longer terms and represent broader constituencies. They can afford, in certain circumstances, to take positions that House members in gerrymandered districts cannot. But the override votes require 2/3 majorities, a threshold that demands significant Republican support in both chambers. Whether that support materializes depends on factors that extend beyond the merits of clean water legislation to encompass broader questions about the balance of power between Congress and the presidency. The constitutional stakes extend beyond these specific bills. Every veto sustained without serious congressional pushback expands the effective scope of executive power. Every override that fails because members prioritize personal loyalty over institutional prerogative establishes precedent that future presidents will cite. The founders designed the veto override mechanism as a check on executive overreach, a way for Congress to assert its constitutional authority when the president acts contrary to the public interest. That mechanism only functions if members of Congress are willing to use it. The current House majority has shown limited appetite for asserting institutional prerogatives against presidential preferences. The question now is whether clean water for Colorado and for the Miccosukee tribe represents a sufficient departure from normal governance, a sufficiently clear case of presidential overreach disconnected from any legitimate policy rationale, that even members conditioned to defer to Trump will conclude that deference has reached its limit. The answer to that question will tell us something essential about the current state of American governance. It will tell us whether the constitutional checks on executive power remain functional or whether they have become formalities observed in theory but meaningless in practice. It will tell us whether members of Congress view themselves as representatives of their constituents and defenders of their institution, or as functionaries in a system where personal loyalty to a single individual overrides every other consideration. And it will tell the people of Colorado and the Miccosukee tribe whether their need for clean drinking water matters more than Donald Trump's desire for retribution against those who have failed to demonstrate sufficient personal fealty. The House returns to session with an agenda that includes Affordable Care Act subsidy extensions, 2 veto override votes, 9 unfinished appropriations bills, and the accumulating pressure of the Epstein document cover-up. 12 legislative days to address all of it. The math does not work. Something must break. The only question is what breaks first, the government funding process, the Speaker's hold on his gavel, or the wall of Republican loyalty that Trump has spent years constructing and that is now showing cracks visible to anyone willing to look.